Behind schedule, so we're going to catch up. I'll ask you all to please take your seats so we can start the exciting part of the day for the members that have been here. So far it was more, AGM and, administrative burden and so on. Now we're going to address the key topics that we've been working on as a trade associations for the last couple of months. But first and foremost, let me welcome you, all of you that are here. And to our members that are following online, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I hope that next year we'll see most of you with us and that we will be doing less and less of hybrid meetings so that you can enjoy as well the opportunity to network with your peers. For those of you that do not know me, I'm Hanan Taidi. I'm the Director General of TIC Council, the trade organization representing the testing, inspection, and certification sector around the world. And I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of our esteemed speakers and panelists that have agreed to join us today and exchange on a topical question. Technology is not helping. So this year our summit revolves around a critical topic that has captured global attention and rightly so urgency, which is how to reach net zero targets in an uncertain world, in a world where we have ongoing wars, 2,000 kilometers away from here, where we have inflation, where we have economic recession in some parts of the world. So how do we reach this target? How do we make sure that this remains a priority despite everything else that's going on? And obviously to make that happen, collaboration, cooperation, goodwill will be paramount, and that's what we want to explore today. So the European Union's ambitious policy framework has set actually a bold course in a legislative landscape, and that the question that we will explore today is whether these policies are going to serve as a catalyst to propel this idea of decarbonization across the globe. We will delve into the challenges, into the opportunities and the potential implications of this framework. And we will examine for our industry the role that we can play to support, accelerate this transition towards a net zero world. But before we embark on this important journey of discussions and exchanges and insights, I would like to take a moment to share some exciting news with you. As many of you may know, last year the TIC Council launched an initiative to celebrate actually the World TIC Day. Why not? There is a World Standard Day, there is a World Accreditation Day. So we said we're going to celebrate TIC sector and we're going to create a World TIC Day. And to mark that anniversary, we created the TIC Forest. Why TIC Forest? Because we as a sector, we believe that we are an enabler. We are an enabler to support the three pillars of sustainability: people, planet, profit. And this is what this forest is about. We're creating jobs, we're supporting carbon capture, and we are helping economy. So last year we had a forest of 200 trees. This year we're adding 200 extra trees, so bit by bit it's trickling, we're growing it, and basically we're giving you, each of you, a tree to follow. Right? So please scan the QR code that is at the registration desk to make sure that you redeem your tree. And I just want to share with you a short film to show the impact over 1 year. It's still very modest, but there it is. So yes, as you can see, it's still a modest contribution, but that's our way to demonstrate our commitment, and year on year we will grow that, forest, and we invite you to contribute as well to this project, at least our members. I keep repeating that every year. Please help us grow the TIC forest as well. So now it is my pleasure to invite on stage to open the TIC Summit Elizabeth Turk. Elizabeth is the Director of the Economic Cooperation and Trade Division at UNCE and leads the division's work across its 4 sections: cooperations and partnerships, innovative policy development, market access, and trade facilitation. The floor is yours, Elizabeth, and thank you for being with us.
So first of all, many thanks for the invitation to join you here in Brussels. And I was saying in the conversations before we started, there is such a vibe, there is such a positive spirit and such an excitement in the room and in the coffee break outside. So that was really, really very nice to feel that good spirit. As Hanan just said, my name is Elizabeth Turk, and I am Director of Economic Cooperation for UNECE. So maybe before I go into my remarks, let me say a few words about UNECE. Not to be confused, Economic Commission for Europe with the European Commission. Yeah? Economic Commission for Europe, we are based in Geneva. We are the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and we are part of the UN Secretariat. We are one of the 5 economic commissions that exist also for Africa, for Latin America, for Western Asia, and so forth. We have 56 member states, and that starts quite counterintuitively in the US and Canada, all of the EU and the EFTA countries, and then in the south we go until Turkey and Israel, and then in the east we go until Central Asia. So we have these 17 program countries, emerging economies in Central Asia, Southern Caucasus, Western Balkan, and Eastern Europe. And as you all know, and we've just had a reference to this, is a very difficult space right now. Yeah, so we have a war raging in the pan-European region, and that really sort of affects us all. Now, what we do in the Economic Cooperation and Trade Division is we work with countries to harness the power of trade, but also of investment and of innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we work with countries in terms of technical assistance and in terms of developing normative tools. And these countries whom we work with, well, that also includes Ukraine. We are quite active in supporting Ukraine these days. And through that, we also hope that we can make our contribution in this very difficult situation. Now, as Director of International Trade, it's a great pleasure for me to be here today, because when we talk trade, particularly when we talk international trade, clearly these questions of certification, testing, inspection, they are very, very crucial. They are essential for making international trade happen. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm also very happy that in our UNECE events, we did have representation from TIC members, and we have them, for example, in our working group on market surveillance, where we discussed about ensuring how products that are placed on the market are safe. We also had TIC Council participation in our work on environmental, social and governance traceability, and also in our work on public-private infrastructure and financing of infrastructure through PPPs. So I'm very happy to see that emerging cooperation, and I hope that after my remarks we will find a few more areas where we can cooperate. Now, for this introductory speech, I would like to take a few messages. Obviously, speaking on behalf of the UN, I will start with the SDGs, and I put my little SDG emblem here. Being in Brussels, I think we need a reference to these amazing active regulatory initiatives and developments that are happening in Brussels. And speaking on behalf of UNECE, I'd love to zoom into one particular product or tool that we have developed and where I think we can do a little bit more. So if we start bigger picture, SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, I guess you know them all, the 17 global goals that were adopted in 2015 by all member states of the United Nations. We have these 17 goals with 169 targets. They are really some sort of call to action for all the countries and people around the world for people, planet, prosperity, peace and partnership. And the SDGs aim to square some sort of circle. On the one hand, we need the economic dimension, industrial development, economic growth. But the SDGs are also very, very much about the environmental dimension, climate change, environmental pollution, biodiversity loss, and obviously the social dimension, labor standards, poverty eradication, human development, and gender, amongst others. So we need to integrate those three dimensions in the SDGs, and we need to address the tensions that obviously these three dimensions bring with it. The SDGs have a timeline. They run or should run until 2030, and that's why we also call it the 2030 Agenda. And right now, we are halfway on the path to 2030. And just a few weeks ago, UNSG Antonio Guterres, he launched the progress report, where the UN looked at where are we on our path towards the SDG, where are we right now at this half-point stage. And the report is quite sobering. Yeah? Let me use some of the words that UNSG mentioned. He said, halfway to the deadline for the 2030 Agenda, we are leaving more than half the world behind. Halfway to the deadline, the SDG progress report shows that only 12% of the Sustainable Development Targets they are on track. On 50%, on half of the targets that member states have set, progress is really weak or insufficient. And the worst part, on some of the goals, we are actually going backwards. We are now worse than we were a few years ago, obviously also because of COVID and the war in Ukraine. So to quote once again UNSG Antonio Guterres, until we act now, unless we act now, the Agenda 2030 will be a symbol for a world that never might have been. And here I'm already looking to our futurologist, what you will tell us thereafter. Now, this is also sobering, and this is all sort of like, if we look at climate in terms of our ambitions for climate that you distinguished TIC delegates you have also chosen for your discussions here today. SDG 13 is dealing with climate, and it's a call for urgent action to combat climate change and the impact, but it's also not really on track. And we know that like when member states met in autumn for COP, we know that the climate models indicated that if we follow the current national actions and the international climate targets that were set in the Paris Agreement, even then we sort of fall short of delivering carbon neutrality and of limiting global warming to the 1.5/2 degrees Celsius. So we know that when it comes to climate change, it's really crunch time. And the last IPCC report had a nice phrase here. It said, like, it's now or never to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So these are really some sort of pessimistic messages and pessimistic outlook, but on an event like today, on a day like today, let's not be so pessimistic. I'd love to refer to some of the really dynamic regulatory initiatives that are happening, particularly also here in Brussels, and regulatory initiatives, but we can also see initiatives of the private sector and consumers. So if we look at the European level, we really see a lot of action. Here in Brussels and in EU member states, just to mention a few, you're all aware of the EU Green Deal, the Fit for 55, the Horizon Europe, and also climate, obviously, is firmly rooted in the Green Deal in the European context. And I think when we go down that road, we very quickly come to CBAM, I think we will be discussing this in a little bit more detail, where I am strongly of the opinion that the work of testing, inspecting and certification has a key role to play when it comes to thinking about some of the CBAM issues. But when we look at these regulatory developments and initiatives, it's not only in the field of climate, it's much broader. And just I think earlier this week, we had another landmark decision coming out of Brussels here, where there was agreement to ban the destruction of unsold textiles. That's a practice to destroy the clothes that are not being sold. That's a practice that contributes to massive waste and pollution in the fashion industry. And the EU textile strategy, that's something we are all watching very, very closely. EU textile strategy says that products that are being placed on the EU market by 2030, they should be long-lived and recyclable. They should be to a great extent made of recycled fibers, and they should be free of hazardous substances, and they should be produced respecting social rights and the environment. So we can also see in areas as close to all of us, the clothes we wear, we see a lot of regulatory developments that try to move us towards the SDGs. Other examples, deforestation, human rights, due diligence. There we have a lot also at the country level in France, Norway, Germany, where countries mandate the companies to assess human rights risks, to address the negative impact, and to also publicly disclose their annual risk assessment and the actions they are taken in terms of remedies. So, of course, we have the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and there are many other initiatives, be it the digital product passport, the extended producer responsibility, and so forth. So I think here we have a lot of dynamic developments. There's a lot happening, particularly here in Brussels. And it's nice to see the European Commission, the EU, as sort of like a front runner. And we hope, or let's say, I would like to be confident that these regulatory initiatives, that they will really create real change. I would hope that the private sector, the companies, that they will adjust their business models, that they are embracing these new environmental and social objectives, so that the business models go beyond purely financial objectives. Of course, it still needs to make sense, a business model from the financial perspective, but that we are moving in that direction. So I hope that there will be change in the private sector, and I also hope that there will be change amongst consumers, that all of us, we will adjust our purchasing practices, that, again, we make purchasing choices that go beyond purely financial choices, that we think about the environmental and social aspects that happened when our clothes were produced or our food was produced. But we also know that this is not easy and that there are many challenges. And let me just briefly mention two challenges. First challenge, greenwashing. Second challenge, development dimension. So let's have a quick look at greenwashing. And here we know that for all these regulatory initiatives, be it climate, textiles, human rights, for them to bear fruit, we need accurate, reliable data about the products and the materials. Preferably, that's accurate, reliable data all along the value chain, all along the life cycle of when a product is being produced, sold, and maybe even discarded at the end. And I think that's why we need you. We need you, the testing, inspection, and certification community, because you are the experts. You can help us ensure that these claims about environmental sustainability, about social sustainability, that they are more than just empty language. You can help us to ensure that we don't just fall victim to greenwashing. So we also have this second challenge. I mean, we have many more, but the second one I would like to flag here today, development dimension. And what do I mean here? Development dimension, when we talk international trade, is really an important topic in the Geneva-based trade discussion. And I'm looking at you, Ambassador, here. I am sure it's also an important topic here in Brussels. And what do I mean here? This fast-changing regulatory environment that I described before, that can also create barriers to international trade. Developing countries, those that are upstream the supply chain, those where, let's say, minerals are mined or cotton is being produced on the field, they might not be able to meet all the regulatory requirements imposed by European regulators. And we see this concern with many commodities. We see it with many industrial products. We see it with human rights and environmental issues. I think it's also at the core of the CBAM debate. And that development challenge, the concern that developing countries sort of will lose out on export opportunities, I think that's really one we need to address if we want to take a global approach that serves all of the world, and that also is in line with the SDGs, where development and partnership is at the core. Now, these concerns obviously are particularly pronounced when we look at small suppliers, small companies, and when we look at regulatory environments that are so rapidly evolving as it is right now. Basically, they change a lot, or when they are different between different countries, different regions, different continents. So I think this fragmentation of regulation also creates an additional challenge. So we need to think about these big open questions. But now enough about the challenges. Let me use my remaining time to give you one example, not lose the time, but use the time, To give you one example of what we are doing at UNECE, and where we are having a work stream where we are trying to create a real difference in terms of the issues I just outlined for you today. That's what we call the UNECE Sustainability Pledge. Sustainability Pledge for Textiles and Footwear. As you can guess, I'm very proud of that initiative. It's one of our flagship initiatives. We launched it in 2021. And since then, the activities we have done under the Sustainability Pledge, we have gathered some 100 pledges from more than 450 partners in 27 countries. And the cooperative approach that we have taken to develop it brings us a network of more than 200 experts from 30 countries and having 190,000 companies represented. So I'm very proud also to say that the UNECE Sustainability Pledge is recognized by the European Commission as a tool that is immediately relevant for companies to fulfill their due diligence obligations. And here I also would like to thank European Commission, particularly DG INPA, for their support. They are one of our donors here. But what is this Sustainability Pledge? What is the idea behind it? Well, the idea behind the Sustainability Pledge is that consumers are willing to make sustainable purchasing choices, and, but they need to be able to do so in an informed way. And to test that, we zoomed into the textiles and clothing sector. The clothes we wear, we are all emotionally attached. We want to look good, but we also want to feel good about what we wear. And we know that textiles is a very environmentally and socially challenging sector. And so what we did with our sustainability pledges, we are having developed a system where we can trace the environmental and social aspects along the value chain of particular textiles products. Now, what specifically the idea here is that when you look at textile supply chains, very complex supply chains, the more you go upstream the supply chain, where, let's say, the cotton is being produced, the less we know what is happening on the cotton fields. And through the Sustainability Pledge, we aim to trace the environmental and social aspects of the cotton from the cotton fields in a country as far away as Uzbekistan, through the production of the fiber, the creation of the T-shirt, until the selling of the T-shirt, be it in Brussels or in Geneva. And I'm very proud that here we are also innovative. I'm looking at our next speaker. We are experimenting with blockchain and digital tools, where we are basically using blockchain to trace these ESG implications. And we have done some 20 use cases with some 85 companies. Most recently, for example, we have for Stella McCartney, one of the kind of like famous fashion brands, and Söktas, that's a Turkish regenerative cotton supplier. We've managed to trace the cotton from the T-shirt from Turkey until the high-end shops. Now, all of this couldn't happen without cooperation. Cooperation in developing the Sustainability Pledge, and we work a lot with private sector and with different stakeholders around this, and cooperation in rolling it out through a partnership-based approach. All of this also couldn't happen if we couldn't have reliable data, and I think that's again where all of you come in, because you're the ones who can test, inspect and certify what exactly are these environmental and social aspects along the value chain. We provide the system about what type of information can be shared or should be shared, how to share it through blockchain and other IT tools, but you are the ones to help us ensure that the information we are tracing on the blockchain, that it's not, as I said before, just empty language. So I think here is really a great opportunity, and I was very pleased to have TIC Council participation in our meetings in Geneva. Now, given the success of doing that on cotton, or textiles and footwear, our member states have mandated us to also look into agri-food. We know this is, again, a sector very, very intensive or challenging environmental and social implications, and secondly, to do it for critical raw materials. And that's really a sector that is right now high up on the agenda of everybody. We need the CRMs to do the green transition, but we also need to ensure that when we talk critical raw materials, we are cognizant of the environmental and social aspects throughout the supply chains. So clearly, we have an ambitious agenda ahead of us. Replicating the Sustainability Pledge to other sectors, further rolling out the work we have been doing in textiles and footwear, and we cannot do it alone. We really do it as a partnership approach, and an approach that involves industry, consumers, countries upstream and downstream the value chain. And I very much hope so an approach that also involves you, the testing, inspection and certification community, because as I said before, it is you who can help us ensure that the information about the environmental and social aspects in the value chain that we are tracing, that this information is reliable and trustworthy. So I think here it's time for me to close. I hope I have sort of like reminded you a little bit about the UN SDGs and conveyed the sobering picture we have there. I hope I have conveyed that I'm proud of what is happening in terms of many regulatory initiatives here in Brussels. And I hope I've made you curious of our work in UNECE. And with that, I would be delighted to see some of you in our next meetings in Geneva when we carry forward that work on environmental, social traceability of value chains. Many thanks for your attention.
Big thanks, Elizabeth, for this passionate call to action and to cooperation. I'm sure we'll have more opportunities to network and discuss with you later on during the dinner. For now, I'm delighted to welcome Ray Hammond, an amazing and a visionary futurist that I came across in a former life back in 2007 when Ray wrote the book The World in 2030, where he had identified a couple of emerging trends that are transforming and shaping our world. So today, I'm curious to hear, Ray, where do we stand compared to where you saw the world back in 2007?
It was all going well until about 5 years ago. But let me explain. Firstly, good afternoon. How are you? There are 6 key trends that shape our future. I identified these trends for the first time about 40 years ago, when I first started researching and analysing the trends that shape the global future, socially, in macroeconomic ways, environmentally, and in all other ways. Of those 6 trends, 2 of them, in the last few years, have changed dramatically. And I shall bring you up to date. The first key macro trend shaping all of our futures is not surprising. It's still world population explosion. We're over 8 billion people on this planet today, and we got to 8 billion about 3 years earlier than the United Nations projected. It now looks as though we're going to hit the 9 and 10 billion marks far earlier than we first thought. And this means essentially that the competition for food, the competition for clean water, the competition for land, and the competition for energy are all going to dramatically increase, because the older generations are not suddenly going to decrease their demand. So we are looking at a situation where, at a time of climate change and environmental catastrophe, we have to find water, food, energy, land, etc., for another 2 or 3 billion people on the planet. Most of the growth will be in sub-Saharan Africa, population growth. Not all of it, some of it in Latin America, but at the moment it seems unstoppable. I very often speak about this trend, and people come and see me and they say, Ray, surely widespread birth control, contraception, is the answer to this. Well, for anybody who studies this, they know that is not the answer. The answer is a long-term and difficult one called education. Because if you educate young women, girls in particular, you will lower the birth rate. But education is slow and expensive and relies upon other elements of life improving. So that's the first key trend, world population explosion. You'll have no prizes if you suggest what the second trend is. It is, of course, climate change. Or now, climate catastrophe, climate emergency. We're at a situation where the extreme weather we are experiencing today is seen all over the world and in all settings. And as a result, we can no longer be in doubt about the reality of environmental climate change. Even as recently as 7 or 8 years ago, I would speak at a conference on this topic, and I would still find people lining up to tell me I had been taken in by those who were actually political extremists. Not anymore. Now, there is some good news this afternoon, and I'm going to touch on that now. But before I touch on that, I want to tell you that at the moment, I'm extremely concerned at the inability of the global community to agree mutually possible ways of mitigating climate change. There were all sorts of Kyoto-type meetings, all sorts of targets being set, but it now seems clear that we will exceed the 1.5°C temperature increase, and that's over pre-industrial levels, in about 3 or 4 years. Now, everybody has said when that happens, it's a tipping point. That may or may not be true. It makes a good headline, which is the worrying element. But we are, if you like, at the 11th hour of the 11th day, etc., etc. It is unbelievably important. But I mentioned good news. And that comes in the third key driver of the future, which is the shift from using fossil fuels to using renewable fuels. Now, one of the things I will say is that for the first time this year, it was announced today that there will be more investment in producing solar power than in finding and producing new oil as energy. This is landmark. This is crucial. And although solar energy has got more efficient at generating power, it's improved by 80% in the last decade, the efficiency, while the cost has gone down between 60 and 80%. I mean, that's fantastically good news. That isn't the reason for this massive change. The reason is the availability and price of battery storage. Now, battery storage, in my opinion, is an absolute growth key industry, because it means that solar power gathered, collected, harvested, when the weather's like this, anywhere in the world, can be kept for use when it's a grey day, when gales are blowing, when there's no sun at all. And if you can keep it in good condition and economically, and then distribute it in good condition and economically, it's a gold mine. Now, if I were a really active investor today, it would be in long-term grid battery storage. I think it will be gold, and I think that is wonderful news. There's very good news about wind power as well. The costs in wind power generation have fallen to a similar extent as they have in solar power. Now, all of that far faster than I guessed way back in 2007 when I was writing The World in 2030, which is great news. But all along, the problem has been, okay, we can generate it, where do we store it, how do we keep it? And we were pumping lakes up to a higher height and letting the water go, and we were doing this, that, and the other. Simples, all we need is battery storage on the grid. And if you place those batteries sensibly and distribute them along the grid, you've got power when you need it. And I'm guessing that this is going to be a key element in fighting the impact of climate change. But there is, as Elizabeth said, an awful lot of greenwashing. There's a terrible, I mean, the need for standards in this sector is unbelievable. And I know TIC are doing a great deal of work in this area. Now, one example today highlighted, you will probably all know in this room that France has decided to ban very short-haul air flights, city to city. And if you can get there in 2 hours on a train, you cannot get a plane to do it. Only once you look at the legislation, it is so full of exceptions and loopholes, it's not worth having. For example, the airport Charles de Gaulle is completely immune. It's accepted. It doesn't have to comply with this. And also there are all other conditions, loads of other conditions, which mean that carriers can continue to operate more or less as they have been. Now this is a classic case of political greenwashing. The headline looked great. France is the first country to ban short-haul air traffic, until you look at it and you find it isn't. So that's the third element, the shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy. The fourth key driver of the future has one of those drivers which has undergone recently a dramatic change, and the driver is, or was, globalization. In 2016, the rot started when Donald Trump put America first. It was more important to him to win elections on nationalistic stand than it was for global development to continue. Until that happened, and it turned out to be very effective, until that happened, I was saying to all of the meetings I was addressing that globalization has done more to alleviate world poverty than any other policy enacted since the Second World War. Over 2 billion people were lifted out of absolute poverty by globalization. And that is an unbelievably good effect. But once Trump said America first, the effect of nationalism went outwards. And then the UK went mad and decided to do Brexit, which is another form of economic suicide, and I have to say, another form of nationalisation and anti-globalisation. Terrible, terrible development for which I apologise. I didn't have anything to do with it. I fought against it. But globalisation now is changing into nationalist competitiveness. China wants, and the cliche, to dominate the world. They do not want to dominate the world, but they do want economic powerhouse. There's no doubt about that. And we've got the same situation happening all over. Putin didn't help with being so nationalistic in Ukraine. We have exactly the same illness. So at the moment, my fourth key driver, globalization, lies in tatters. So what I'll be putting in its place, I don't know yet. It can take a bit of time to show. The fifth key driver of the future are the multiple revolutions occurring in the field of medicine and healthcare. Only a few years ago, each year, I used to sit on an advisory board for the Prudential insurance company. And people like me were there for regulatory purposes because they were obliged to ask outside experts about their views they came to when judging amounts to give away in annuities and similar. The big question that was put to us each year is there likely to be any change in the longevity of people with Alzheimer's disease? By far the biggest killer of the very elderly who have probably got insurance one way or another with Prudential. Each year we would say no, because there was absolutely no glimmer on the horizon. But in the last year alone, there have been 2 or 3 drugs, 2 of them with approval, which are now slowing the signs of Alzheimer's, slowing the onset and slowing the death of those people unfortunate enough to suffer with the disease. Now, I'm going to add to that a few other areas of intense breakthrough DNA profiling. Anybody here had their DNA analysed? Yeah, one. So for everybody else, DNA means do not ask. DNA is extremely useful for shaping medicines. Now, everybody with a serious cancer gets the tumour's DNA analysed so that drugs can be tailored to the tumour. But it won't be long before every newborn, the DNA is taken if the parents agree. And with that DNA, the whole pattern of a child's life can be seen in outline. It doesn't mean you will get the things you're susceptible to, but steps can be taken to guard against. Now, if I fall seriously ill in the future, I certainly want DNA on my side. Now, we can also talk about gene therapy, and most importantly, I suppose, we can talk about the role of digital technology in healthcare in terms of monitoring a body's performance. Invisibly, you haven't got to walk around with huge machinery strapped to you. Small wristbands will do blood pressure and ECG. So we're finding that what will happen is that old people, people who are ill with lots of chronic diseases, will not necessarily be held in hospital, but can be treated in the jargon, what's called distributed hospitals. In other words, they can go back home and they can be monitored as closely as they are if they were in the hospital bed. And of course, it will be a human that intervenes and provides care, because I do not think machines can replace the personal touch of a doctor in the healing process. Now, I could, as you can probably tell, do my whole talk about healthcare. But I want to move on to the other key driver, the sixth key driver, which has suddenly changed beyond belief. It is accelerating exponential technology development. Now, in the last 6 months, generative AI in the form of ChatGPT has passed, without any doubt at all, a very famous test called the Turing test. And that is the point at which computers, who are arguing in a narrow range of limitations, not in general discussion, cannot be differentiated from another human being. And ChatGPT-4 particularly, and others like it that are now under very rapid developing, are causing computer engineers, software experts to ring alarm bells. Last week, 4 Microsoft engineers who are developing this sort of generative AI said, we have an AI that is displaying human-type reactions. The most important thing about calling it human is that it's learned to lie. And it lies itself for its own purposes. Nobody quite knows why. One AI wrote a scientific paper about climate change, funnily enough, and referenced a well-known, it said, scientific article in the journal Nature. And it referenced it with a link at the bottom of the page. That article had never existed. The author didn't exist. And this AI calmly parked it up as part of the answer. So if they are lying, oh boy, they're human. Because that is probably the most key human element there is. Now, the net result of this is that we are going to see an explosion in the use of AI. Initially, teachers will have to watch out for who wrote the homework, but we're going to see an awful lot of service representatives on the end of phones who are not human. We're going to see a lot of jobs, especially at service companies like telecoms companies and similar, being replaced by these chatbots, which will be able to answer the question. They'll be able to do the job, because most of the questions are repetitive and simple. Now, what this comes down to is there will be a lot of, I won't say unemployment, but a lot of churn in the employment market in the next 5 to 10 years. But I suppose the real worry is that this Turing test passing, this arrival, has said that we are now at the beginning of the technological singularity. And if anybody here is unsure what the technological singularity is, it's a phrase that people like me, futurists and futurologists, have been using for 30 years to describe the point at which, and I'm going to choose my words very carefully, computers become as capable as humans. Now, that doesn't say more intelligent, it says as capable, and by that, it becomes as capable of problem solving. Because the moment it does that, within 6 months it's twice as capable, 4 times as capable, and so on. This is why it's called the singularity, because rather like a black hole in space, a proper astronomical singularity, you cannot see beyond it. Now, somebody suggested today I might want to talk about the year 2050. Because of this singularity coming, it's impossible to guess. You can't even take a stab at it. But to look on the bright side, I think it's going to be extremely useful in helping dealing with climate change. I think it will be able to suggest all sorts of better ways to discuss carbon capture and carbon reduction. And it will certainly be able to tell us which approach is worth doing and which is worth most. And with that slightly more optimistic note, I'm going to thank you for listening. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right. Food for thought and food for discussion tonight. I don't know if I feel optimistic or I want to go crawl in bed and and wait for whatever is coming. But let's try to get some glimpse of more hope. Mark, what do you think? Let's try. Let's give it a stab. So thank you so much, Ray. That was extremely insightful and indeed food for thoughts. And with no further ado, we are running slightly late, but I'm calling now for our next panel, which is actually going to explore the need for international cooperation to tackle climate change. The title of the panel, and our first panel, is How International Climate Policy Frameworks Can Be Influenced by Region-Specific Approach. We have that regional view. Today we're delighted to have representation from the Chinese embassy, from the United States by a member of our global board, Jenny, and of course the United Nations with Elizabeth Turk. So I'm delighted to welcome Mark Van Oekelen. He is the former and first EU ambassador for climate diplomacy. So thank you so much. And Mark, I give you the floor for you to call your speakers.
Thank you, Hanan. Not easy to start speaking after such a great explanation of the shaping factors for the future. What I'm going to do is first provide a brief introduction of the subject, and then I will call the 3 speakers on our panel to the floor. The title of the panel is How International Frameworks Can Be Influenced by Region-Specific Approaches. Now, as already referred to by Elizabeth and by Ray, slowing down global warming presents us with a tremendous global challenge. The IPCC report of the 23rd of March of this year was also mentioned, and that states that if we want to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach, the world needs to cut emissions the next 8 years by 43%, and by 2035 by 63%. On current reduction plans, if they are implemented, on current reduction plans, the world will have made a cut of 15%. So there is still a huge effort to be made by all major economies because the G20 account for 80% of all emissions. Climate being a global public good, international cooperation should actually come natural. For example, in fundamental research, exchanging policy experiences for the conference of today, developing common standards, reporting and verification of emissions, be it by countries or by companies, or setting up global carbon markets, to mention a few subjects. At the same time, divergent national climate ambitions and use of different policy instruments, together with the fact that mastering technologies for the clean energy revolution will much determine the future competitiveness of a country, set the stage for policy competition and trade friction. So if one country is climate ambitious and others not, there is a growing risk of carbon leakage, with more imported goods coming from the low ambition countries or companies from the ambitious country moving elsewhere, where climate rules are laxer. There is also the risk of an international subsidies race, with countries trying to outcompete one another through grants or tax credits to lure foreign investors. In sum, very much needed as it is, climate action can boost cooperation, but it can also stoke international tension. These are the issues of today's first panel, which I'm going to open up in a moment, and I will ask the speakers to come up. But before doing so, let me open up a poll in Slido, which I think you all have, if Julia can tell me that that is correct. The question for the audience is, what role do you believe international collaboration will play in accelerating the transition to a green economy? Do you think that that is essential for success? Then it's A. Do you think it's helpful but not crucial? It's B. Do you think it's irrelevant and unnecessary? Then it's C. And finally, if you think that collaboration is a hindrance to progress, it is D. Now, let me then ask the speakers to come up, and the first one is Elizabeth Turk from UNECE, who has already spoken to us, Jennifer Scanlon, President and CEO of UL Solutions, and Mr. Wu Gang, Minister Counselor of the Chinese Embassy in Brussels. If you could join me now on the panel. Let me start the discussion by asking a short question to each one of you. And let me begin by asking the question to Elizabeth. You work for UNECE. You therefore have a natural multilateral perspective. How do you see this emission reduction effort playing out? Do you see those emissions cuts coming? Will we see more cooperation on this, or will this actually give rise to more rivalry between countries?
Thank you. Well, it's a multi-billion-dollar question. I'm not really the best person to answer this, but like you pointed very nicely to the development challenge that I already mentioned in my introductory remarks. And if I now take approach of where I would like things to go, I would like multilateralism to be really part of this. And I am convinced that the UN and the platform we provide can be a forum. We have proven to be a forum for that. And I think the essence is really also to square that circle between countries and the different stages of the value chain, and countries that, as you just outlined, have very different competitive strengths and weaknesses in terms of when it comes to dealing with climate change. On the economic cooperation and trade side. Clearly, we need to discuss. We need to discuss carefully. We need to discuss in the different fora, and multilateralism here is not only the UN, it's also the World Trade Organization. So I would think that we even go to an area where different organizations cooperate with each other.
Thank you. Jennifer, given the business UN Solutions is in, how do you see the nexus between the green transition and standardization?
I think everything starts with standards, and I'm going to give a little bit of background, both on UL Solutions and my perspective. I mean, first of all, I found the keynote on the trends just captivating, and particularly as you think about, what has led to a lot of the advancements, both in medicine and technology, grounded in many standards. And I think Elizabeth painting a picture of the challenges that we face in that green transition highlights that some of these challenges are immense, and at the same time, they're the reason why these technological advancements are happening. Now, when you have sustainable industrial investments, I know it's not all financial, Elizabeth, but standards can help set the stage to ensure that you're making the right bets, that you're not wasting your time or energy in something that is not going to come to be the right answer. So, and as I look back on our company, UL Solutions, we were founded as Underwriter Laboratories, 129 years ago, and we were founded really for three reasons. The first one was safety science research around the technology of the day, which was electricity. We were founded to write standards around the electricity of the day, and we were founded for public advocacy on those topics. And I think when you look at our TIC industry, and I'm the one up here representing our industry, I think many of our companies were founded for those same reasons. And setting those standards against the technology challenges of today, which is climate, harmonizing those standards around the world. That doesn't mean they're identical, but it certainly means that they're in sync with one another. And then ensuring that you have consistent conformity assessment to prevent the greenwashing that both of our previous speakers described, and to prevent many of the other challenges around it is essential. So that's where I'm grounded in this conversation, and that's my perspective.
Thank you, Jennifer. Turning to Mr. Wu, how do you see the global effort to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and where does China see scope for cooperation between countries in this effort to preserve a global public good?
Okay, as far as China is concerned, China has always attached great importance to the climate change problems, and we are not a talker of the talks, but we are the walker of the walks. So in the year of 2020, China has formally proposed in the 75th session of the UN General Assembly that China will strive to reach carbon peak by 2030 and strive to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. So it is a very ambitious and solemn pledge by a responsible developing country to the international community and also to human society. So actually, during the past 10 to 15 years, China has provided concrete results in this regard. I can read some examples. For example, ever since 2000, the year 2000, the Chinese people are the most arduous and hard planters of trees in this earth. We have planted 64 million hectares of trees, and we have resulted in 1/4 of the newly added green areas in this planet. So we are also pledged to plant more than 70 billion trees in the coming 10 years. That is one thing. Another thing is that in China right now, as for the energy consumption, the hydropower, wind power, and photovoltaic power each amounts to more than 300 million kilowatts. All are the highest in the world. And I can raise a very small example. That is last year, when China held the Winter Olympic Games in Beijing, all the 26 venues of these games have realized 100% green electricity. So Beijing Winter Olympic Games is the first one in Olympic history that has realized carbon neutrality. And as still a developing country, we are on our route to a Chinese modernization. We will strive to abide by our commitment and strive to realize a green transformation of the development economic models. But it will take very hard effort and also very hard joint coordination with the international community. For example, through the Belt and Road initiatives, China has right now 2/3 of all the countries in the world has joined the BRI. So we have established contacts and joint cooperation documents with more than 150 countries. So within the BRI framework, one thing is very important, that is to realize a green BRI. We have signed a MOU with UN Environment Program to realize this green Belt and Road. And also for green BRI development, China has signed agreement with more than 31 countries. So there were just some examples.
Thank you. Let me now go back to Elizabeth. There is scope for cooperation. At the same time, when there are not global rules, clearly there is also the potential of competition. Some countries have started, or some parts of the world, notably the EU, have started to introduce carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Other countries are engaging in a program of heavy subsidies for the development of their green industries. What is your take on this? Are these unilateral initiatives going to level up the effort to emission reductions, or is there a danger that this is going to run into rivalry, which in the end leads to a negative sum game?
I'm positive in nature, so I would hope that we get towards a leveling up. And you mentioned the two key approaches, the carbon border adjustment. And it's interesting because it's, at the moment, always discussed in terms of climate, but one could even cast it wider, sort of a sustainability border adjustment mechanism. And so that's this one approach, and the other one is the subsidization approach. Now, let me see in terms of where I would like things to go. We really need to think about the value chains, and we really need to think about the value chains as a mechanism for cooperation. So rather than only thinking about trade and border measures at the import and export process, maybe we can think about value chains upstream and downstream, where also the companies cooperate. And this is where I find the due diligence approach a very, very interesting one, because it's also about the responsibility of companies along their supply chains. So it's not only an approach saying we ban import or we make imports more expensive, but I feel that's one where we can build cooperation into it and maybe reach a situation where companies have an interest in working with their suppliers to help them level up for their own benefit as well. So for me, this taking a cooperative supply chain approach would be an avenue to go. I also very much appreciated what you just said in terms of the role of international standards, harmonization and cooperation there. And I think that brings us also a little bit, again, to the role of the UN, where many of these international standards are set, not in terms of being a very rigid standard, but moving us, nudging us in the same direction. So I think I see the opportunity a little bit in a slightly softer approach, a slightly less rigid approach where we don't need to think about trade dispute settlement, but where we think about cooperation between countries, between companies, and between different stakeholders.
Very good. Jennifer, given that UL Solutions works or has its home base in the US, what are the recent developments policy-wise that have affected the green transition and everything having to do with measurement, testing, inspection, certification?
I think that there are a number of important policies underway in the United States. I think, first of all, it's been extremely important that President Biden has demonstrated a recommitment to bringing the U.S. back into the Paris Climate Agreement, and with the ultimate goal of limiting global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. And what you see in the United States is many industries coming together, converging to make these climate-neutral technologies available. A second piece of that, then, has been the recent announcement of the Inflation Reduction Act. And the purpose of this is to drive incentives and investments, and it's to accelerate the transition to the green economy, to clean energy, and to have new clean energy resources. And I loved hearing that there is as much investment in solar as there in renewables as there is in fossil fuels. And I would agree that that advancement of energy storage systems is a key piece of that, and it's a key piece of the IRA. It was really interesting for me earlier this week. I stopped in Denmark and I hosted an event with the U.S. ambassador to Denmark, and he pointed out that a third of the wind turbines that are going into the United States as part of the IRA are being built in Denmark. So the connection between the continents is essential, and this driving of these investments really does, I think, bring about kind of raising the tides in all parts of the world. So to me, those are two of the biggest pieces of recent investment. I'll talk later about what I see happening with both energy storage and the grid and the way in which it's going to change all of us as consumers and our role in all of this.
Thank you. Mr. Wu, clearly China is putting in place a lot of plans to cut the emissions from the Chinese economy. Could you elaborate a bit on what are the main development plans that China is implementing with regard to emission reduction?
Okay. China is a country fairly good at plan to some extent. So recently we are within the time span of our 14th five-year plan. So 14th, that means ever from the founding of the PRC. So you see, so the economic miracle and the social stability miracle was to some extent realized through all these plans. But action should be accommodated to the plans. So that is why China is also a fully prioritized its implementation of all these plans. So I think figures or statistics speak louder. I can give you several other examples. For example, from the year 2012 to 2021, within the pandemic, China has supported the average annual economic growth rate of about 6.6% every year, with the energy consumption annual growth rate of only 3%. So 3% 1 year to support 6.6% economic growth. And apart from that, I can raise another example. During the past 15 or 10 years, many transformations to use green energy and use green technology has taken place in China. Just last week, when China was holding the China Central Asia Summit, one of our dignitaries is the president from Kyrgyzstan, President Zaparov. Apart from attending the state visit in Beijing, he paid a short visit to Shandong province. So why did he want to visit Shandong? Because Kyrgyzstan purchased 1,000 buses from Shandong. And President himself was there to attend the roll-off ceremony of the first batch of the 1,000 buses. But why was this buses so important to receive a president to attend the ceremony? Because it was not fuel buses. It was new energy, natural gas buses. The carbon dioxide emissions from these buses are reduced to up to 30%, and the sulfur compounds are reduced to 99%. And this is just one batch of purchase. And Kyrgyzstan is planning to purchase another 1,000, maybe another 1,000. So just now, you have mentioned about the value chains. China believes that apart from value chains, industrial and supply chains are also very important. So if we want really to coordinate and join together to solve this climate change problems, so there should be no decoupling or any de-risking or any severing of the value chains, production chains. So every country can leverage their advantages and their efforts to contribute. So the mayor of Bishkek, he said, China's buses will greatly solve the problems of pollution and transportation with Bishkek and other cities. And we are doing quite a lot of these kind of things.
Thank you. I'm going to put a pretty hard question to Elizabeth now. You referred in your own speech to the pretty sobering picture with regard to progress on the SDGs. Ray, yourself, myself, we refer to the fairly limited progress with regard to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Given your work in the multilateral context, what is it that multilateral cooperation could do better to try and get to a faster achievement of the SDGs, and notably the realization of the objectives of the Paris Agreement? I know it's a very tough question, because if it were a simple one, it would already have been answered. But what do you think is needed to get us into higher gear?
You've posed me a series of very tough questions now, but that's why we are discussing the tough questions here today. Now, maybe to preface this, let me pose the counter question: how would the world look like if we didn't have multilateral cooperation on that important issue? Yeah? Mm-hmm. And we are living on one planet. We are sharing the resources of that planet. We are economically integrated. There is no other way than going about it multilaterally, because we are in that boat together. And I'm confident that with all the challenges the UN is facing, with all the sort of like situations we are going through, the world is better off with multilateral cooperation than without. And here I include both UN, but also World Trade Organization and the IFIs. Now, what could we have done better, or where could we step up efforts? Let me mention two key functions of the UN here. One is obviously the platform for negotiation. You mentioned the Paris Agreement, and sort of like exchange of views, the somewhat softer, not legally binding solutions that are coming out of the UN. Another one is helping countries do better. And here I talk about the development pillar of the UN. And we've just heard about the important activities of China, also in Central Asia, in the Belt and Road content. So in the UN, we have just undergone a reform of that development pillar, where there are country teams in each of the developing countries. So for my region, that also means in the 17 program countries in Central Asia, Caucasus, Western Balkan, and Eastern Europe. And these country teams, they are like a mini UN. They combine the different aspects: education, technology, trade, economic issues. And I think here it's supporting countries also in a coordinated way. Yeah? So I would say where we can step up efforts, or where we need to continue, is the negotiating platform, the international exchange of views platform, the sort of somewhat softer, and very importantly, the supporting countries to actually implement the changes that they need to go about. So while I've talked about global value chain in terms of the private sector, the companies cooperating along the value chain, I think there is really very, very important for countries and for the UN to concretely support individual developing or transition economies in terms of meeting the new obligations, be it through innovation, be it through technology, be it through education, all the things we heard before about.
Can I add to that? Because I think what Elizabeth's hitting on is just extremely important, and Mr. Wu said this as well. I mean, climate change, it's a global challenge. It was interesting. I woke up this morning, my husband had texted me a photo of Lake Michigan in downtown Chicago, where the sunrise was muted because of the wildfires, smoke coming 2,000 miles away from northwest Canada. It is a global challenge. There are no borders to this. And so it doesn't discriminate amongst regions. And regions are adopting the net zero targets, net neutrality for Europe by 2050. You look all over at the ways in which it has to build resilience, but we have to have collaboration at this global level, as you've described. But it also means that we have to have very local public-private partnerships around this. And I always like to give examples, but I think our industry, the TIC industry, plays a very vital role in this sustainable transition and in the help of some of these multilateral opportunities. And I think it's because we serve as trusted partners to regulators, and we use science to drive those ambitions. And it allows us to move forward in helping our customers with their certifications and assurance services. And it allows both products to launch into countries and work across organizations in a much more, sustainable way. So, where I want to summarize is I always like to give examples. And I think a really good example of public-private partnerships, it can be seen in the United States, it can be seen in Europe, it can be seen in Greater China, and it's around environmental claim validations. So going back to greenwashing, the EPA in the United States has set out an approach for this, and we in the private sector have an ability to fulfill that. The same thing is happening with local substantiation schemes here in the EU, and the same thing is happening in Greater China. And I think that, continuing to understand that it's the UN, it's the governments, but it's also we on the industry side play a big role in this multilateralism.
Following up on that, obviously we need to have more cooperation internationally. At the same time, there are different approaches to the subject. How does the fact that especially the bigger players, be it China, the US, and the EU, have somewhat different approaches towards the needed effort to cut emissions, how does that affect your work as an organization with regard to standardization? Does the fact that there are different implementing rules, does it complicate your life, or how do you see this question of different standards across the world trying to tackle the same problem?
Yeah, I think it's important in our industry to help our customers navigate the differences and also help them identify where there's commonality and opportunities to streamline, their value chain to ensure that it hits the right answers. I also think it's important for our industry to advocate for the right standards, play a role in those development with the standards development organizations, bring science to the table, bring a customer perspective to the table, have industry involved, and ensure that what's good for our customers is good for the world, and what's good for the world is good for our customers. And I think, I keep harping on it. Doesn't come back to the financials, but at the end of the day, so often that is what drives change is the financial realities of what can work. It's becoming financially realistic that renewables are the right answer. It's financially realistic that microgrids are taking over for the traditional grids. It's financially realistic that you can put a solar panel on top of your house and become a node on the electrical grid instead of an endpoint, because you've got battery storage systems and other pieces. So I think that's our role as representatives of the industry.
Elizabeth.
Two key points, because I think you're saying something really important here. Like, in order to make things financially realistic, you sometimes also need the right regulatory framework.
Exactly.
So they go hand in hand.
They go hand in hand. They absolutely do.
So that's one thing. And second, you also referred to that challenge of companies needing to navigate different standards. Yeah? And now put yourself in the shoes of smaller suppliers in the developing world. They need to access the EU market. They need to access the US market, the Chinese market. What do? You certify triple, you sort of like change your modus operandi in different ways. So already the fact that we have these divergent approaches, I think, creates an additional challenge.
It does, it does.
Before we move on to questions from the floor and the answers that you will have given to the Slido question, perhaps one question to all three of you. Given where we are now in terms of the fight against climate change, what is it that you would still want to see from policymakers, be it policymaking at home or the question of cooperation? Why don't I start with Mr. Wu?
Okay. I think for the policymakers is to lay out a clear plan and to stick to implementation and to honor the commitments. For example, I'm from the Chinese embassy representing China, the largest developing country in the world. And my friends here are representing developed countries. So in this regard, I can raise an example that is, we hope that the developed countries will honor their commitment raised as early as 2007, 2009 in the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference. That is to pledge $100 billion per year in climate action in developing countries. Just now, the two ladies has mentioned the financial support, which is very important because we have to admit there are gaps between developing countries and developed countries because they are in different status, different phases of development. We can only realize a sound result of climate control only when the developing country become developed. Otherwise, it will be very, very hard for all the inhabitants of the earth.
Elizabeth.
Quick follow-up. I very much agree. We need the clarity and we need the sort of consultative or cooperative approach in developing the way forward between North and South. Now, let me add to this, we also need a multi-stakeholder approach in the development of the regulatory environment. So that would be public sector, private sector, other stakeholders. Yeah, that this cooperative approach to charting the way forward is really sort of like also cooperative in terms of the different players. Now, in terms of where else to go, we've discussed already a little bit trade, we've discussed a little bit like investment. I would like to just flag innovation, because I think that we also heard it before from futurologists. Innovation is so crucial, and innovation is, on the one hand, the digital innovation, but it's also societal innovation. Yeah? So one thing that we hear a lot right now is really transformative innovation. What can governments do to facilitate transformative innovation? And that is innovation that is not purely technological, but that drives societal change. So I would like to see a little bit more emphasis on this really transformative innovation.
Jennifer.
And I echo both of those comments and just want to add that collaboration is key. And that doesn't mean identically equal. It doesn't mean uniformity. You have to understand what the local traditions, requirements, environment, situation is. But I think policymakers, they are aware, but they need to be increasingly aware of the benefits of having compatible regulatory frameworks. It's not one winning versus another. It's everybody winning because you get to a good common denominator. And so, you know, we strongly recommend, and I think our industry strongly recommends, that there is more engagement in common frameworks.
Very good. I don't know what I don't see here on my screen here what the result is of the, I think 74 replies came in, but could anyone give me the Slido result? Very good. So, perhaps not surprising, the answer number A, that it is essential for success cooperation, got 88%, helpful but not crucial 11, irrelevant 1, and hindrance, so counterproductive 0, which is, I think, fairly logical. In terms of questions that we got from the audience so far, was something that we already touched upon, and that is very concretely in the field of standardization, testing, and whatnot, what could be concrete areas for cooperation between the various big economic blocks, leading, in a way, the technology and the innovation for the clean energy revolution? Concrete operational areas where cooperation could be fruitful. Who would like to share thoughts?
Can I share an example from Jennifer, from UL Solution? Before this panel discussion, we chatted with each other. Last month, UL Solution established a new lab testing consuming goods in Shenzhen. And from your website, I learned that UL Solution has joined the Chinese market for 4 decades.
Exactly.
And 4 decades means what? Means the growing up of Shenzhen city. 4 decades ago, Shenzhen was nothing but a small village, a fishing village. And 4 decades later, Shenzhen is the biggest metropolis in South China and also an economic growth engine and also a hub for scientific innovation. So that is very illuminating to see that with this kind of collaboration, with this kind of pitching in and sharing and learning from international expertise and also with Chinese policy maker to decide to reform and open it up, the result of Chinese economy is the joint efforts of internal and external elements. And also today, I'm very glad to have representatives from Chinese sides, that is from the CCIC. The delegation is participating also in this conference room. And the CCIC is also one of the most, I think, important membership of TIC. So we are fully confident that through international collaboration, we'll have fruitful results. And this year, 2023, marks the 20th anniversary of China-EU Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. And China and the EU see eye to eye in many international situations and affairs. We can collaborate. Of course, we have difference in certain specific views, areas, but I think the mainstream is collaboration and cooperation. And let's keep on this momentum.
Thank you. Jennifer.
So I'm going to go back to 3 words: safety, security, and sustainability. And I'm going to go back to my example of houses becoming fully functioning nodes on the power grid as opposed to an endpoint. And what you need around the world to get there with this in a good way is you need safety. You need to be able to safely install solar panels so that they can safely store energy at a home facility in a way that has not traditionally been done. And then they have the opportunity to become the transmitter. So you've generated the energy, you're now going to transmit that energy. You're going to power your electric vehicle. You're going to think about how do you take excess energy and return it to the grid. You're going to become a node on a microgrid. You're going to take your EV, and when there is some type of weather event, like we have in Chicago in the Midwest, blizzards where the electricity is knocked out, that EV is going to power your house for 3 days. It's going to replace your generator. And so thinking about this kind of just your own home and your participation in this circular energy world and the electrification of everything, you need that safety, that you're going to not have fires, electrical shocks, damage from that storage system. You need security, that now that you're connected to the grid, that you're also not vulnerable to cyber or other attacks. And you need that sustainability piece, that photovoltaics on your roof and the ways in which it's going to power your vehicles in the future. So that's where I think is just a good example about how individuals anywhere in the world working with regulations, understanding how you fit into that safety, that security, and that sustainability is going to be extremely important.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
I'm not from the TIC industry, but let me flag 2 points that, and I think I've alluded to them before. Let me come back to my value chain example. So what we are interested in is tracing the information along the value chain. Yeah? So I'd love to really hear from the TIC industry what pieces of information can be counted as comparable or interoperable. Yeah? Because when we look at that value chain, we cannot compare apples and pears. So for me, that brings us also to the whole question of standardization and harmonization. But again, I wouldn't go so far as to harmonize everything. It just needs to be interoperable in terms of the information that we are comparing along these value chains that crisscross the planet. And the second, I've also said it before, is like, how can we help the countries and the economic operators to do it? If we just think about the testing and inspection, let's take an agricultural producer from Kyrgyzstan. You've mentioned Bishkek before. To export the dried fruits, that needs to go through a whole lot of inspection and certification. The country doesn't even have the capacity to do it all, and hence is impeded in its export opportunities. So I would say also here, support technical cooperation from the industry to build the capacities to do the testing, inspection, and certification in the exporting developing countries so that they can actually do the exports and benefit from the economic opportunities.
Thank you. One further question from me, and then I will ask whether there are any further questions from the floor. We still have 10 minutes to go. Liz? 5. All right, because I see here 9. I'm getting conflicting signals here. The other day, I was speaking at a conference, and many businesses said, we all understand this urge for ESG, environmental, social, and governance. At the same time, this is giving rise to a lot of paperwork and red tape. CEOs came to me and said, our annual report is going to be twice the size of what it used to be. As people who have worked in the field of standardization and certification, what would be your response to the CEO saying all this is going to give rise to a lot of box ticking and what have you without much value added? Well, it's something that is heard very often. So I think you're well placed to shed light on say, the value added of certifying company statements.
So I'll start, and I'll start with just when you look at the landscape of sustainability reporting, it seems that perhaps ground zero is going to become the ISSB, which is connected to IFRS, and that they are going to be setting those standards. And I think that it will be important to have those standards so that every company, every investor, every financer, every bank, everybody doesn't want something different. But I think within that, it's going to be important to be very clear how you, one, not just report, but understand what standards you should be headed toward. And I always like to use the example of if a hotel reports that it uses 50 gallons of water per patron, is that good or bad? Mm-hmm. And So in getting to that reporting, I think we have to get to what's valuable to the decision makers, both in funding the company as well as the decision makers around how that company, interacts with the world. So where ISSB is going is extremely important, and then ensuring that there are industry leaders helping get to a set of standards that are meaningful is extremely important.
Elizabeth.
Briefly, I would first hope that it's not only box ticking, but that there is really sort of some concrete action behind it. And then pursue two avenues. Assuming we are talking now about standards that are not obligatory for everybody, I would hope that documenting ESG compliance, that this will also create new business opportunities for the companies, that it will open up new markets of those consumers who are wishing to make an informed purchasing choice. Secondly, assuming we are talking about ESG standards that are really for everybody, then I would say as long as it lifts up everybody, there is not even a competitive advantage of doing the paperwork behind the box ticking. And last but not least, in UNECE, our member states set us these cross-cutting priority themes every 2 years. The current one we have is green and digital transformation. So I would assume that much of the paperwork will ultimately become digital, and it will be a totally different approach to reporting, to capturing information and consolidating information. So I think that's something that we will see happening in the near future.
Mr. Wu, how are things in China with regard to ESG compliance?
Okay, China values ESG very much because we think the ESG concept is very compatible with China's new concept of development, of creation, coordination, greenness, openness, and sharing. Actually, ESG plays a very important part in one achievement China has recently made. That is the alleviation of destitute, of severe poverty, which has been realized by the year of 2021. During the last 3 decades, China has alleviated more than 100 million people from severe poverty, and among which enterprises, both the state-owned, the large enterprise, and the medium and small-sized enterprises, has joined in. And one thing to encourage them to participate in this poverty alleviation campaign is the ESG. So any enterprises who participated in poverty alleviation can receive credits for their ESG performance. This is one thing. And as to the digitalization of China's economy, I can say that nowadays the total volume of China's economy, about 50.2 trillion yuan, RMB yuan, are digitalized, which constitutes of more than 41% of China's total GDP. So we see a bright future with the ESG endorsed with the digitalization of the economy.
Many thanks. I think that brings us to the end of panel 1. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you to all speakers for wonderful insight and great exchange and great ideas that we can pursue over a short break. We will resume in 15 minutes max. So I'm going to ask you to please be on time as we have the other speakers that have arrived. So glass of bubbles for a bit of optimism. Thank you.
Oh, I'm not sounding a bit listening.
wherever he wants. The president, where he wants. Let's play. Where is the pause? Where is he was called here, and he did not go there.
As he said,
He wanted to see the results. Instead of him clicking, he was just asking, so what happened? Maybe. She might come. Oh, since he's on the stage already.
Yeah.
So moderate.
Welcome back. I hope you have enjoyed the break. Now we're moving towards the last part of our summit. So the bit between you and the food and the drink. Michael, bit of a pressure. So now we're going to dig in a little bit. We're coming from this macro view to go and talk about one specific instrument or one specific legislation. Again, I think one of flagships initiative in this fight against climate change that Europe is driving. And we're going to talk about specifically the certification for European carbon removals. Is it a model for more robust global carbon capture schemes? So Michael, he is obviously most well to all of you. Otherwise, it's my honor and privilege to welcome the gentleman who has recruited me to IFIA and with whom I have been working for the past 6 years, our president of TIC Council and CEO of TÜV Rheinland. Michael, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Also, once again, welcome back to after the break. For us now, after we had in the session before discussed somewhat on the macro level what needs to be done to, let's say, to save the world. And we now want to be a little bit more concrete, because the one thing is what we discussed before, going into more renewables, reducing the emissions that we are having by moving into other technologies. But of course, there's also a different point, because we always talk about climate neutrality, and neutrality means not zero emission, but climate neutrality. So there needs also be some kind of removals or some kind of compensations required. So that's why I'm quite happy to have here a distinguished panel today with me, and I would like to introduce my panelists. Next to me is Christian Holzleitner. He's currently head of unit responsible for land, economy and carbon removals at the UN Commission's Directorate General for Climate Actions, and we will hear from him what is actually the status, what is the status of discussions on the side of the European Commission. And then next to him, it's Francesca Jacquer. She will be the voice of the TIC industry, not me here, so I'm really the moderator. Francesca has been a global segment manager responsible for audit and compliance at SGS since 2021, and also has a lot of experience in this field, and we just shared already a little bit on CDM and things like this from Kyoto Protocol a lot of years ago. And then we have Caroline Ploux. She is currently working for Mars in the Brussels-based Government Relations Service Center, and she has been with Mars since 2016 and has worked in R&D on sustainability programs. So also now as representative of the industry, of course, also this is very important to have a comprehensive picture. And last but not least, we have Anoush Zhao. She's leader of the Environmental, Social and Governance Center of Europe for Europe at the Conference Board. Anoush has led the sustainability research practice in Europe. As well, he has served as Council Director for the Environmental Strategy Council. But before we hear from the experts, we would also like to have a Slido question, and also would like to have your views on the point. And the question that we would like your answers on, your opinion on is, do you think that Europe and the world need a carbon certification framework, so a global certification framework to achieve the targets that we have set out and that we have discussed beforehand? So we will have now the opportunity, as mentioned, here's the Slido access data and the passcode. So it would be nice if you, as well as those visitors who are online, can contribute to this. So now, why Europe needs a carbon removal certification framework? This is one of the points, and that's why we would like to start now with Christian's view. And yeah, Christian, could you set the context with a brief overview of what's happening from the European Commission on the area of carbon removal certification scheme?
Yes. Hi. Good afternoon. Thanks a lot for having me. Big pleasure to be here. And maybe let me start also at the high level that you discussed before. We have in Europe this target to be climate neutral by 2050. So this means by 2050 we shouldn't emit any more CO2 to the atmosphere on balance, because as you said, we will still have emissions in the system by 2050. So we estimate maybe around 400, 500 million tons from livestock, from the use of fertilizer, but also from some hard-to-abate sectors like cement or long-distance air travel. So to get to that zero, we also need to get better in capturing CO2 from the atmosphere. and then storing it either geologically, so maybe in the empty gas fields of the North Sea, in our forests, in our soils, or even like in long-lasting products, like wooden buildings. And that will not be an easy task. Carbon removals are not an easy thing. And so we need first to understand better the cost and benefits of the different technologies. So we have the ones with geological storage, so direct air capture with CCS, which is a technological way to get the CO2 out of the atmosphere and then put it underground. Bioenergy with CCS, so you burn biomass, but you don't let the CO2 go back to the atmosphere, but you catch it and put it down. So if you think about it, there you can have like produce heat in a climate positive way. The tree captures the CO2, you burn the residues, but you don't let the CO2 go back to the atmosphere, but you put it away. So it can be a very attractive proposition, or like also for the paper industry. Then you have all the solutions around carbon farming. And there, for us, it's not so much, from a climate perspective, it's not so much about putting everything back to nature, because we will need biomass in the future. We will need biogenic carbon, because we won't have any more fossil carbon, like, for example, as a feedstock for the chemical industry. So we need to look at ways, how can we produce food and biomass in a more sustainable way, so that we keep more carbon in the soils, but also in forests. So, for example, looking at agroforestry could be something very, very attractive. And, of course, the most powerful measure is the rewetting of peatlands. That's not an easy one, but this is one we need to tackle. And then, of course, also looking like more towards 2050, the storage in products is becoming quite attractive. Think about construction material, wooden construction material, so you can really make buildings a carbon storage. Or think further down the line, maybe on bioplastics as a very sustainable packaging material. So there are a lot of things we need to tackle. The more we talk after 2030, 2040, we'll talk a lot about a better material management. So, but the first step that we want to do with the certification framework is really to understand the costs and benefits of it. Because any geological solution needs a lot of energy to get the CO2 out of the atmosphere. For carbon farming, you really need to take a very close look on biodiversity. You want to have the win-win solutions between climate and biodiversity. And then for products, it's really something we are starting off to how could we also there track the carbon stored in products. So it's a very tiny first step that we are taking now, but an important one now.
Okay, maybe then going to the colleagues on the panel, Karen, from industrial perspective. So would this be of relevance for you as an industrial player, as a manufacturer, in your way, in your strategy to become carbon neutral?
So maybe I should say to start that, so we have a net zero ambition as well as Mars towards 2050, and we've got intermediary targets as well for greenhouse gas reductions. So as such, we've not waited for a framework to be in place to already invest into carbon removals. But I think an important distinction we make, and I prefer to make it right now because I think it will come back during the discussion, is that we make a distinction between carbon removals we achieve within our own supply chain. And I think the value chain and supply chain was mentioned during the first panel, and we do make that distinction. So anything we invest, with our suppliers, our farmers, sequestrating carbon into the soil, and also delivering some co-benefits often from a biodiversity or water storage perspective. So we make a distinction between this that we think will actually represent a good chunk, we think it could be up to 10% of our net zero overall journey for Mars, versus the carbon removal, that we purchase through carbon credits or carbon offsets on markets. And we are, as well as a company, investing in these markets, the reason being that we know that on the agricultural sector, we know that it will be really, really tricky to reach net zero without these extra removals. But they only come second. First come reduction and removals within our supply chain.
Okay. And Anush, maybe how do you assess it coming more from the investor's perspective?
Sure, thank you. I think I'll mention 2-3 words first. I think Christian's already talked about hard to abate. That's very important for us to remember. You also said something very, very important, and I think that's very key. It's about reductions first, removals second. Now let's look at the reality, and I think the one thing is we're going to take a step back to let's look at the universe of companies globally, many of whom you are serving. Climate strategies or net zero strategies. And let's look at the large companies. Let's go for the ones who are responsible for majority of the emissions. We see 1 in 4 has set a net zero target. So that's the current reality you're looking at, roughly. Now, of those, some have consciously, is a good example, consciously chosen to say, well, actually, we are going to consider offsets have a role to play or removals have a role to play. That forms part of our strategy. That's important. But the majority have left with 2 choices, is that we want to send out a signal to the marketplace that we are climate neutral today. And this is not a judgment call whether that's right or wrong, but actually their net zero strategies are not supported by any action plans. That's a big danger, a big area for us to talk about. I think we've already heard about the challenge of greenwashing. I think that's important to put into context. Now talking about, and there's investors you can put 2 lenses to the investors. You can take an investor who's assessing, an asset manager who's looking to assess whether we should be investing in a corporation or not based on their climate strategy. So that's one investor. And the investor can also be a corporation like Mars, who would say, where should we be deploying, or what should we be considering as part of our net zero strategy? So let's look at the asset managers first. Now, the current reality is the asset managers, how the conversation has evolved is they're still engaging with their corporate clients, their investees, that you have been talking about your climate strategies and target. We need to see some action plan. That's the current maturity. In essence, that's where the conversations are going. That we've seen the big pictures, we've seen the lofty ambitions. Tell us, how does it link to your investment decisions? How does your strategy link to your climate strategy? So that's the first thing. So they have not reached to the notion of whether you're using climate or carbon offsets or removals as yet. But from a corporation perspective, we know, and again, I talk about the universe of companies because that's important. It's only a handful of companies who have spent time consciously thinking about at what stage in their net zero transition journey do they consider offsets or removals. We know, and you hear about these case examples every now and then, that there's always a nice pilot project. I mean, you talked about some, the traceability pilot project, for example. You always have those examples, but we are quite far away from making this a mainstream reality at this stage. But having said that, it is a step in the right direction, what Christian mentioned. A small step, but a step in the right direction, because that's what we need to give it the credibility, to give it the teeth, so that investors can be confident that we are making the right decisions backed by a sound, solid standard. And I think you mentioned about the need of standards.
Okay. From I think, the further discussion, we always have to look at, let's say, the 2 aspects. So one is really removing into your own production, removals, and what you mentioned was also mainly removals in Europe, CCS here, storing in the Northern Sea, North Sea there, and the other is then compensating with projects anywhere else in the world. I think those are the 2 points of achieving climate neutrality. So, Francesca, you are now here the technical expert.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. I definitely agree with what has been just said. So there are definitely 2 elements, and it's 2 elements that apply equally, I think, to companies and to countries. So we had the countries earlier, and now we have the corporates and the projects. So at country level as well, I think all the countries that have either committed or about to commit to net zero, they really have to flesh out in their policies what is the role of carbon offsetting and carbon removals. So what is the percentage of that will be allowed to achieve that famous net zero? For corporates alike, that needs to be fleshed out, and Mars is actually doing that. With regards to the framework and the Commission proposal, it's obviously most welcome. It's in a highly controversial sector. We're talking about removals, we're talking about soil, we're talking about peatland, we're talking about technology solutions. There's a lot out there today, but I must say it's a little bit like the Wild West. There's a lot of money floating around. There are platforms with different type of claims, so I do believe that a framework would definitely help in terms of consolidating at least the inputs and an outcome. It will be hard. I think it will take more than a year to come up with sound methodologies. There's nothing really out there. And there are a lot of technical issues regarding that. There's, first of all, how do I set a baseline, especially when we're talking about nature solutions? I think that's the most complicated piece of work to tackle. Then how do I ensure additionality, and how us, the TIC industry, actually validate or verify that all of these is actually compliant with a certain methodology. How do we ensure permanence? That's another big topic of discussion. Is it 30 years, 40 years, the 100 years that everybody wants to see? Or if something happens, how do we bring that back to where it was before? An example maybe in the UK, and I know unfortunately we're no longer part of the EU, and again, not my fault, and I apologize as well. We have, and you must be familiar with that, we have a peatland code and we have the woodland code. And what they issue is not a credit, it's a promise for a credit once there's a verification process that actually is being put in place either after 5 years, 10 years, or even 30 years. And that gives a little bit, a certain level of certainty that that project will still be there in 30 years' time, and it will have been monitored along that 30-year period. Just an idea. But I think the TIC industry is happy to have a framework. We will be more than happy, and I know that Hanan and the TIC industry, they're already on the expert group providing inputs. And I think we're all involved in that, behind the scenes, providing inputs to Hanan's team.
Yeah, thank Francesca. And just to give you the results from the question we had in Slido, so it's 92% supporting that we need to have a framework, and I think this is supporting that today we are still somewhat in a Wild West, and everybody is looking for some kind of clear guidance to know where it needs to develop to. And so that's maybe once again now looking at this as we are a little bit in Wild West, Caroline, do you think it's difficult right now to identify potential projects, or do you believe there is a vast range of options of things that can be developed, and what's missing for it?
So I think, again, I will make that distinction because it's important. So if we start outside of our value chain, so really, purchasing on a voluntary carbon market, a credit or an offset. So today you've got like a couple of standards, the gold standards, the American Carbon Registry. So you've got a multitude of this, which already means you don't have harmonization out there. What that means as well for a corporation like ours is that we need to do our own due diligence on top of it. We do social diligence as well. That's a component that is very important, I think, when we speak of in certain geographies in particular, and for Mars it's very important. So indeed, in that case, like the credibility that like a common harmonized framework could give would be very strong, especially for this outside credit markets, outside of our value chain. Now, when we speak within our value chain, that's slightly different, because we know we have like a direct contact through the value chain with our suppliers, with the farmers. Well, in our case, it's farmers. But that means here, like actually when we speak with our suppliers, it's more, the difficulty is not so much the credibility, but finding the sweet spot between a system which is robust enough to bring that credibility, whilst remaining affordable, that's very important, and pragmatic, because what we wouldn't want to see eventually is a farmer having to monitor his soil every day. That would be highly inefficient, and it's very important that farmers still prioritize food production. Like, for us, that's absolutely a priority. So I think it's a different debate depending where we place ourselves, and carbon farming is a bit specific, and whether when you're in your own value chain, maybe from a credibility standpoint, you're like more directly connected as well, and this can be taken into account.
Okay. Anush, you mentioned or the panel before mentioned the importance of the international collaboration. And we just heard Karin said, yes, we have certificates from the US verified, and we have here a standard, and there a little bit a standard. So from an investor's perspective, how you value if somebody said, okay, I'm climate neutral because I have some certificates from anywhere, which is not really the global standard. So is it where you also say we need to have more international collaboration to have also there a clear standard, global standard for those kinds of compensation certificates?
Absolutely. I mean, I think before I answer that, I think you said something which triggered a thought. Now, over the last 6 months, the carbon offsetting industry, which has been going for 15, 20 years, what has happened? The gamekeepers of that industry have found out to become poachers. I think we have to look at the whole credibility has been questioned. So the need for internationally recognized standard is absolutely paramount. Because as investors, as corporations, why would I want to be investing in something in 5 years' time if the credibility is questioned? Because we know that litigation risks are absolutely going through the roof. And that's a big challenge for corporations. As investors, and I'm talking about investors as a corporation, if I want to be considering removals, I need assurance, I need verification, and I need to ensure that it does not backfire for me in 5, 10, 15, or 20 years' time, because we know this is going to come under scrutiny, because the stakeholders, all the stakeholders are becoming more smart, more sophisticated, and they have the means, using technology or anything else, to verify whether the claims hold or not. So the need for standards is a must. Now, the question is whether the standards would be recognized globally. And that's a big challenge for us all to address. Whether the EU standards or the standards are proposed, whether they would be embraced by different jurisdictions. Would there be alignment? Would there be harmonization? If there's harmonization, how long would it take? We never know, but I think it's a step. The first step is a step in the right direction.
So then let's get into action. How to get there, Franziska?
Will it be accepted everywhere? Is that framework going to fly outside Europe? Well, first we need to see if it flies in Europe, then we can see if it flies outside Europe. But I think the idea of the framework is excellent. What's missing today is the methodologies. We know that there are some methodologies already through the VERA, the VCS, Plan Vivo. I could mention, 10 of these voluntary schemes that have at least methodologies for afforestation and forestation. There's also a couple of methodologies of direct air capture and storage into materials, building materials. But the difficult ones are missing. They're not there. So when we talk about soil, when we talk about carbon farming, when we talk about even direct air capture and storage, there's bits and pieces of methodologies. And I think what's important is that methodologies are developed at global level so that they can be accepted by a wide array of stakeholders. And now I'm thinking about the UN trying to come up with methodological approaches for removals through Article 6, because that's another big element. So I think if those methodological approaches can be worked all together and have a common recognition of the methodologies, we're already a step forward. And then we can look at the frameworks, which may differ. We don't need the same ones, provided, I think, the basis to validate and verify are the same. So what we don't want from a TIC industry point of view, find ourselves in a position where there are different accreditation systems across the globe, where in every country we have to go through a different set of accreditation, where we need to have auditors that are qualified according to different requirements. So that would really help us provide not just capabilities, but I think also standardize the outcome so that we can ensure that quality is the same across the globe.
20 years ago, we had, after the Kyoto Protocol scheme, which was a global scheme, and also a global database of certificates, which have been removal certificates, or let's say CO2 reduction certificates at that point in time. So we have one of the regulators sitting here. So is this something where you say, okay, yeah, we look at it and we look what was good at that point in time and what was not working that much, and taking this as a reference and saying, okay, now let's, not just in the EU, but sitting together within the UN, trying to develop this? Or is your focus for the time being looking that we get something done in the EU?
Our focus is in the EU, because carbon removals are more difficult than emission reductions, because you have this time element. And you want to keep the carbon stored over a long time period. So you need quite a level of trust that this happens. Because it's not just, okay, I've now applied a certain methodology, I planted one tree. It's about taking care of this tree for 50 years. So it's a completely different level of commitment. And this is what we are looking into now for Europe. How can we build on existing infrastructure of certification? We have like the sustainable bioenergy under the Renewables Directive. We have organic farming. And we really would like that, that those guys also take on that additional element of the carbon removal. So to see, okay, how much carbon is stored in there. And our framework is very much modeled on the sustainable bioenergy under the Renewables Directive. So we don't want to invent there anything new. We will really want to build on an existing European system, and that has also already globally, I think, gotten to a bit of a standard. And so what we've defined and what we are setting out is, okay, you need 4 quality standards, and the first one is quantification. And on bioenergy with CCS, direct air capture with CCS, I'm quite optimistic that we will quickly get to a standard. We know how to calculate that. We have the liability rules from the CCS directive, or the Carbon Capture and Storage Directive, so we need to put that together. On carbon farming, I think what is essential is that we reap the potential of digital technologies, of Earth observation. Because if we don't manage to get the monitoring costs down and to make it easily accessible to farmers and foresters to join such schemes, we will not arrive there. It's about bringing the incentives down to the level of the individual farmer and forester. And it's about empowering them to take control of their carbon balance. And I think that's an attractive offer for them, because then they have a metric that they can control. And there we must get to. So it's on the one hand what we can provide as a framework, but it's also we really need the technological development there. And I think that there are a lot of startups out there. There are a lot of things that we can see happening. Then we need to see about this permanence question. And this is one of the main innovations that we are offering with our framework, is this temporary certification. So that we don't say that like a storage geologically is the same as a storage in soils and forests, because there are risks. So we are designing this temporary certification, so for 10, 15 years. And there we are inspired, like from organic farming. A farmer will not be ready to commit for 200-300 years, not over generations. So you also need to make an attractive contract that farmers are taking this up, and this is one element that we are doing here. And then, as I said, then sustainability, biodiversity, where we want to take in existing standards like positive, negative lists. And if you see that carbon is, in a lot of cases, in particular soil carbon, already also a good indicator for biodiversity. So by, for example, focusing our first methodologies on the rewetting of peatlands, I think we can have these win-win solutions that we need for climate and biodiversity. But it's not, I think, our ambition to develop here new standards for biodiversity. We want to take up what is already on the market.
From an investor's perspective, happy with what you're hearing?
Well, so there's actually, I'll give a different analogy. Yesterday I was moderating a webcast on the topic of circular economy. And one of the speakers said that we are moving from a linear economy to a recycling economy. We're not moving towards a circular economy, we're just moving towards a recycling economy. And when I asked for what's the sole one thing you would like, what's your request, he said education. And when I hear what Christian is saying, the need to have an informed audience, how do we know that the investors or the people who are making the decisions that I should be investing or I should consider option A, option B, option C, and these options are direct air capture or bioenergy, CCS or biochar. How do we know that a chief procurement officer or a CFO, they're the ones who are going to make a decision? How do we know they are informed enough to know that in 15 years' time, this is going to be the pricing, this would be temporarily, I will not get any credit for this option in 5 years' time? How do we know they have that sophistication to make the right decisions for their companies? I think that's the real challenge, is how do we ensure the people who are making the decision, we make it easier for them to make those investment choices. And of course, eventually I think it will come to the organizations like TIC Council to also go and validate, assure that they can take the credits for what they're investing in. So it is not an easy solution. I sit here on the fence on this one because we have to make it easier. If something has to stick, we have to make it easier. And in this instance, it does not feel to be easy.
Carolyn, if you would get a temporary certificate, happy or not?
Well, I think the topic of permanence, especially when we speak about carbon farming, is a tricky one because by nature, the soil is like something which will evolve, and we know that like an unlimited period of time is not reasonable. But we think that there are several solutions. So one of them is actually one that we use today when we do carbon removals within our supply chain, which is the use of buffer pools, meaning you sequestrate additional carbon, and in case you have removals, you use that pool as an insurance. But ideally, these buffer pools, they would be like big and collective so that, you know, really the risk is covered. From a trust standpoint, that would be like the best solution. But beyond this, we believe, and especially for carbon farming, that if these certificates can be used in our scope 3, that would be the best solution, because then, you know, on a yearly basis, you are reviewing your greenhouse gas inventory. And so that's why, especially when it comes to carbon farming, again, we're asking for the clarification of that use, because we think it's really a theory of change behind it. It's, do you want for anyone, so being, you know, the tech industry, the aviation industry, to invest into carbon farming, or do you want net zero to be achieved within the agri-food system? And here it's really a theory of change standpoint, but also more from a pragmatic standpoint, thinking about the expert group that you're running, Christian, and which I think is a really good initiative to bring everyone around the table. There are certain concepts that we can't really define without understanding the use these certificates will have. Because concepts like additionality, like baseline, they are not the same if you think within a scope 3 approach or within a credit or offset paradigm. So that's why we think that really this clarification of the use will be key in the discussion.
Francesca, from this now looking, we touched a little bit how global this can be when you hear that now from the European perspective. First we look at the Europeans, say we want to have carbon removals here and up and running, and then let's hope others will join in. Do you believe that it will be easy then to come, and what could be the contribution of a global scheme?
Maybe a global scheme would be likely or unlikely to happen. I can't see a global scheme. I can see maybe coming up the successor of the CDM that would be partially global. There may be a stepping up of the VERAM VCS following recent criticism, maybe reviewing a little bit the gaps or the grey areas of their methodologies, especially the ones that have been fiercely criticized. But I think there's a good in sharing methodologies. So if the European Commission can actually come up with a series of methodologies that are new and they don't exist today, even with the concept of a permanent or a temporary credit, I think that would work, provided the accounting behind is done. So you account for something today and then you discount it tomorrow because that's not permanent, and that would equally balance. And then also provided, and that's not for the TIC industry to decide, that there's clarity on the use. So what can companies do with these temporary removals? Yeah.
Okay, so
a lot of work.
A lot of work, and I think that's why I understood why you say we have so much work for Europe for the time being. So it's not. But do you believe that later on you can convince other regions to follow, or will it be so complex that it will be more first view for Europe?
So, I mean, what we want to focus on is really the technical work on the certification, a bit more on the supply side. And what we want to deliver is all the necessary information that you then need for different uses. But like in Europe, where we talk about the uses, is on the one hand now with our initiatives on green claims and the corporate sustainability standards. There it will be defined. There's a fierce debate going on. Can companies say they are climate neutral? Can they use offsets for debt claims? And so on. So this will be decided here. So we're working parallel on several pieces of legislation on that. But what I believe is, if you look forward into the future, the amount of carbon removals that we need in Europe to reach our targets, I don't think that this will be achieved through voluntary carbon markets. We really need to have a think about our next common agricultural policy. We have a think about a compliance market, how to integrate carbon removals there. Because otherwise, I don't think we will meet that step change. And as I said, one shouldn't get confused that there are a lot of cheap credits now out there for 1, 2, 10 euros. But if you look at the costs of the carbon removals that we need, be it on the technological side, be it also in agriculture, you easily talk about 100, 200 euros per ton of carbon, so higher than the current ETS price. So we are not here talking about greenwashing cheap solutions. We are really talking about very serious stuff, and to get that off, we will need to look at public and private financing.
From a perspective of an investor, so will this improve the competitiveness of Europe, or will it be detrimental?
I think a bit of context is needed, if that's okay. I think that we are talking about a very, very specific area, and maybe it's better to, because carbon removals eventually comes down the chain, although it's very, very important, but it comes down the chain to talk about the competitiveness. I think the sentiment, what we hear, and I think so, and I speak from a third-person perspective over here, you know, the sentiment we hear from business leaders is simplicity is key. Now, when you look at the regulations which are coming out of the EU, I mean, when you look at the sustainability reporting directive, which is a step in the wrong, personally, I'm supportive of it, but actually what the business thinks is that maybe working in the EU is complex because the regulations are not easy. So what's being asked of businesses operating in Europe, so their CEOs are making a choice, or they are being forced to make a choice because there's a perceived perspective that it is more complex than it needs to be. So that's the reality from large global businesses operating in EU. Now, of course, we also had a very nice, interesting discussion because you talked about the previous panel discussion, talked about the approach EU is taking in relation to, say, CBAM, compared to what the US has done in relation to the Inflation Reduction Act. The different approaches. Now, actually, maybe a CEO might think it might be better for me if my customers are moving away from Europe, I should also invest somewhere else. Now, there's no black and white answer for this, but that's the sentiment we get, that businesses need long-term policy intent, which is there. So we know the direction of travel is set, but how do we make it easier? And you might say gradual, given the climate crisis, gradual is not the option we're talking about, but how do we make it as less painful as possible for businesses? But I'm not talking about, in this instance, I think so, it's a step in the right direction. We need that clarity in the framework, but I think so it's more from an EU perspective when we talk about the regulations or the directives you look at from other issues we're talking about.
I can also imagine it's a question of timing. So when do we have then the removals? Because Personally, I'm convinced that a lot of companies who have committed to climate neutrality by 2025 or 2028, in their calculations, they've taken the $3 or $4 per certificate of compensation. And if we now tell them, oh, sorry, it's not 4, it's 100, because it needs to be a carbon removal here, then a couple of those companies who have committed may think about if they stick to their commitment. So that's maybe for me also, Caroline, as you mentioned, with the voluntary certificates and now with the scrutiny that it is on it, how do we can get there to a standard which is widely accepted? Most probably it will not be the €3 or $1 or $5, but it will also not be the 100, but it will maybe be in the area of 2025, solid reduction projects, something like this. Can you see this? And what was you as international company, how you look at it?
Well, I think first I wanted to react, and that's very linked to the question you're asking, to like the trust word that you brought, Christian, linked to the greenwashing, because these are like the two opposite. And for us, obviously, as a brand owner, it's critical. I mean, we've got consumers in the end, we've got customers, and it's also like Mars is a family company, so like it's the investment of the family eventually that they want to put at the right place for the right purpose. So when we invest in carbon removals, we want them to be robust, and this is very important. But banning carbon neutrality, as it is getting discussed right now, actually at the European Parliament level in terms of the green claims, we think would be detrimental in terms of the incentive you're creating to companies to invest. So instead of this, what we would favor actually as Mars would be to have transparency on what a carbon neutral claim really is about. And actually the French model is quite interesting in reaction to this. I have a pen, one of our brands is Rail Canin, based in France, and we've got a commitment towards carbon neutrality by 2025 with this brand, and we're progressing. So we are compliant with the French law, and we actually disclose how much we're reducing versus offsetting. And we disclose the price, not the exact price, but a range of the price of the offset, which gives already a signal of the quality of the offset, because to your point, if it's an offset at $3, it's not a quality one. Versus if it's one more towards like the 50 or 100, then you can say, okay, it's probably more robust behind this. So we think that's as well where the legislation can play a role in bringing that transparency rather than doing a full ban that would keep the incentive in investing whilst bringing the transparency which is necessary in that space.
Jessica, there are a few, let's say, scheme holders who came up with those schemes, as mentioned. What can the TIC sector, what is the role that the TIC sector can play in this to come to a more credible system where everybody is really, where we don't have the scrutiny discussions later on or greenwashing discussions?
Well, the TIC sector already plays a major role in the voluntary carbon markets and the mandatory one, so ETS, for instance, so if we want to talk about both. But let's stick to the projects. Obviously, the TIC industry is not all of the TIC industry, but most companies are what we call VVB, so validator verifiers, within the voluntary scheme. So we see names of our companies on the list of accredited entities with Vera, with the gold standard, and with the up-and-coming new voluntary schemes. Now, again, we can ensure that the methodologies has been applied equally and faithfully. We can verify that the outcome of the project is exactly what had been forecast at monitoring stage, but we have not a say in the methodology per se. So if the methodology has gaps or is faulty, it's not the TIC industry responsibility to say. We can obviously, and we do have conversation with the schemes in terms of flagging it to the scheme, but our role is really to ensure compliance to the methodology, and does the outcome match what's been declared? So that is our role, which to a certain extent, it is, you know, a rubber stamp on anything that could be potentially greenwashed, because we ensure that it's not. So what we say, it's compliant, it's true, and that number matches.
Christian, is the regulator looking at those methodologies and saying we are the ones who say this is an accepted methodology for calculating?
Yes, this is our approach. Contrary to the private certification schemes, there will be one methodology decided by us, to together with the co-legislators. So we want to have one methodology for the rewetting of peatlands, one methodology for bioenergy with CCS. And this can then be applied by private or public certification schemes. But this is also, I think, in terms of the incentives for the design of the methodology, I think is key that it will be us as the European Commission, together with the expert group, and then with the co-legislators, that we will decide on the methodology. And there will be one single methodology for the European Union.
When will we be there?
So, as I said, we are quite positive on bioenergy with CCS, direct air capture with CCS, that we can deliver that quite quickly. As also, I would hope agroforestry, rewetting of peatlands, or like wooden buildings. That this is something what I would see that we will work on over the next years.
Next years. So what is, Christian, maybe that's asking you, what is your vision for the implementation of the proposal to ensure success?
I think we will be successful if we have this one methodology, that this gains acceptance. What I also said before, it's really about the costs. We need to bring down the costs in carbon farming. We need to use digital tools of observation. We need to get better in soil sampling, and we need to get this done. And as I said, we can only be like the first step. What will be then decisive is how do we finance those. So, and this will be for the next Commission to decide what is the design of the next common agricultural policy. What is this design of the climate policy after 2030? And we already have a public consultation on that out there, if I can make a bit of publicity for that. And there you will see a lot of questions about carbon removals and agriculture, because this is a really, and materials and circular economy. This will be the decisive questions for 2030, because and 2040, because our economy in 2040 will or should look very different from the one we have now, because already in 2040 we should use much less fossil carbon.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this was a very nice final word with the vision in 2040 by reducing and removing a lot of carbon, that we have much less of this carbon being emitted. Thanks for the views of the industry, both industry from the financiers, but also from the TIC sector on this topic. I believe it is a hot topic and it will stay a hot topic. And also I think it's coming clear that the support from the TIC sector is necessary, is required to have credible schemes. And I think it's also made clear that we are willing to contribute here to have credible schemes in the way that the investors know what they're investing in, that it's not, as you said, not investing into projects where later on the scrutiny on. I think this that nobody wants, and that we're also supporting go in this direction. So thank you very much for your participation. I just looked on Slido. I have not received any questions from the audience remotely, so I'm looking, is there anybody here who wants to have a comment or a question in the room?
Everybody's hungry.
This is also not the case, and this gives me the chance to nearly close in time. So we've made up a little bit of the time because we want to be right on time. Thank you very much. With this, we are coming to an end of today's summit here, and you're highly invited that we are going down now to the, what is the name of the room? Anand, you know the name of the room? In the Park Ballroom, there is set up that we can have there a dinner. Thank you very much for joining. It was a pleasure having you here. See you soon. Thank you to you.
I hope we didn't lose too much there.